I'm going to talk about NTM and the environment. Let me make sure I know how to do this. So, we sort of designed this session around questions we hear all the time from patients, right? And I'm sure some of you have asked yourself this question: should I not shower? And not because dirt keeps the bugs away, but because we know that there's bacteria in the water supply, and in fact, we're living it today and yesterday here in the District of Columbia, right, where we had a boil water advisory. So one of the, ironically, right at this conference, so one of the things that comes up is, am I re-exposing or exposing myself to these bacteria by using aerosolized water? So what I am going to do very quickly is to review. This is mainly focused on the non-tuberculous mycobacterial organisms. I'm going to review where in the environment that they come from. I'm going to give you just a brief update on what we think the evidence is regarding transmission from environmental sources. There's some data on this, there's some opinion on this, and I also going to just say what the guidelines are or recommendations for patients from various guidelines, from advocacy groups, and from experts. So we've already heard, that there's a rising incidence of both bronchiectasis and non-tuberculous mycobacterium in North America. And I'm sure, every patient and we physicians, too, are asking, why this? But also, why in you yourself, why am I getting this disease, right? And we're really struggling on the individual patient level to figure that out. But we think it's a combination of something with the patient and something with the environment when it comes to NTM. So you have to be sort of predisposed for some reason that makes you vulnerable to getting the non-tuberculous mycobacterial infections. And some of those things we can identify and treat, as we've already heard, like if your immune globulins are low, we have a treatment for that. If you're on high-dose prednisone or you're taking one of the biologic drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, we can do something about maybe stopping those. We know there's genetic reasons why some people are predisposed to these infections. We wish we knew every genetic reason. We know certainly cystic fibrosis, but where we struggle is when people don't have a clear-cut example, for example, of cystic fibrosis. They might have a slight abnormality in their cystic fibrosis genes, but not the true disease. We know some people, we've already heard great pictures about ciliary abnormalities. If your lungs are abnormal to start with for whatever reason, maybe you had a bad pneumonia as a child or you had tuberculosis, that puts you at risk for getting these infections later in life. And we also know, that patients with a certain body type, and it happens to be thin women over the age of 50, Ken Olivier from the NIH has been the one, his group described this, and certain other structural abnormalities like deformity of your breastbone, your sternum, mitral valve prolapse. Some of those things seem to be associated with the risk of getting non-tuberculous mycobacterium. So we think there's the two-hit hypothesis, i.e. you're vulnerable and then you're exposed to these organisms in the environment, and that's why you get sick from them. So just to give you a little terminology, and again, this talk is all focused on the non-tuberculous mycobacterium, which we know that not everybody has that here, but everyone with bronchiectasis is at risk for it. And I'm sure many of you have heard us talk about MAC, which is a complex of multiple mycobacterium that are grouped together. But the truth is, MAC is what we get from the lab for the most part, but there's different subspecies within MAC, avium intracellulare, and then one called chimera. About 85% of our patients in the U.S. who have NTM have MAC. That's the most common non-tuberculous infection. But a smaller number of patients have another organism called Mycobacterium abscessus complex. And again, within Mycobacterium abscessus, there are some subspecies, and they're relevant because they have different effects on the patient. One of our big problems, and many of you know this, is that our labs are not exactly fantastic. Unless you send your sputum to certain places, like where these two physicians work, we have trouble because LabCorp, Quest, I mean, they're not here, so they're not going to hear me badmouth them, lose specimens, lose 2 specimens, send reports that don't make any sense. We can't get reports. And we know we're stuck with these labs, so a part of our mission here is to try to work on that problem. Let's, just briefly, we've already heard in the urban water systems, and summer versus winter, there's different concentrations of mycobacterium in the water. We also know household plumbing sort of concentrates these organisms, so taps and filters and our hot water heating systems are places where these organisms can proliferate. Additionally, certain ones are also in the soil and in the dirt. So just to give you a little bit of data on this is Australian data from Brisbane, where there was a difference in the quantity and ability to culture these organisms at different times of year, and that might have relevance for what you might do about this. It's also, one of the big dilemmas we have is that we tell you that you have MAC, right? But it turns out that if we knew it was the avium subspecies of MAC, that's the one that's much more in the water than the other subspecies, intracellulare, which is in the soil. So it's a little bit problematic that we sort of give blanket recommendations about things because it's not really the same for all patients, and we need to do a better job at kind of personalizing this. We also know the pipes have something to do with it, and the type of chlorination is also relative, something we can't really fix. Some nice studies that were done by Dr. Falkenham from Virginia Tech and colleagues, and also by our colleagues from Tyler, Texas, showed that these are some places in your household that kind of are more likely to be full of these organisms, and shower heads, water taps, and hot water heaters. I already said that intracellulare, the subspecies of MAC, is actually in the soil much more than in the water, although because it's in the soil, it can contaminate pipes as well. So it is a risk to get it from the surrounding soil. And I just point out, we're aware of these things because there was a recent outbreak of this third subspecies of MAC, Mycobacterium chimera, in devices that are used in cardiac surgery. But these didn't cause lung infections. They caused infections of the sternal incision, where they go through your breastbone to get to your heart. So we know about this stuff, but it's just our labs that process your sputum, as opposed to when there's some sort of outbreak, are not as diligent about giving us the final answer. I also want to say, though, we need to take notice of these kind of things because obviously we've just been talking about all these devices and vests and aerobicas and nebulizers that you're using, and part of the thing we physicians definitely fail at is to teach you how to clean them, right? We really do a terrible job at that, and you should tell us that because we need to instruct you how to keep these things as free of infection, sort of reinfecting yourself. It's not perfect, obviously, but we need to do a better job on that clearly because we know that this can be a problem about medical equipment. So what do we know about the environment? Actually, some data from Washington State and Oregon looked at a whole bunch of water sources and other behaviors of patients, and they really didn't find a lot that had to do with showering or watering plants or things like that. A similar study was done in cystic fibrosis patients. They actually found indoor swimming might be a little bit of a risk factor. So we just told you to go in the pool, but it's kind of a mixed blessing, the pools, because of especially closed-in pools with this issue. And then we know from studies that have been done in the Northwest, but also in other parts of the United States, particularly in the Philadelphia area, that household water supplies can be part of the problem. And finally, there's a Japanese study that looked at soil exposure and people with high levels of soil exposure, i.e. gardening 3 hours a day or so, might be at risk for Mycobacterium intracellulare. So let me just say that this is the behaviors that were looked at. So showering, tub bathing, hot tub, and this is the study from Oregon, saunas, humidifiers, dishwashing, swimming pool use, spraying plants, spending time near sprinklers. I don't know how many of you keep track of that kind of activity, but they did look at that, and they actually only found that spraying plants with a water bottle seemed to raise the risk of NTM infection. Some other things that come into play here are the age of your home. It turns out well water is, not that we have no water, right? But well water is somewhat safer than piped in water. And all these other things are something you have to think about, but you don't have to fret or overly worry about this either, because there's a fine balance between being exposed to this and overdoing your staying away from it, right? It's been looked at in CF patients, and again, as I said, indoor swimming might have a slightly increased the risk. And finally, looking at patients with NTM, because what's happened, again, we have to personalize this much better than we do. We really have to know exactly what species the patient has, and then if we're going to look at the water pipes or the hot water heater, we need to know that they're really the same species. So you don't want to be oversold on the idea that you need a filter or you need to get a new hot water heater or whatever, because it may, even though you might be MAC there and MAC in you, the MAC may not be the same MAC. So again, part of my reason to do this talk is to kind of put it out there that we have some data, but to kind of play down the hype that's out there a little bit about these exposures. And I already mentioned the soil. Let me turn to that. What about patient-to-patient transmission? I guess we're all here, right? And of course, we encourage good hand hygiene and that kind of thing. There really is no evidence that I'm aware of right now that MAC can be transmitted patient to patient. I'm not going to say never, but right now there's currently no evidence. There is a little bit of concern about Mycobacterium abscessus, that it's been transmitted within a clinic environment, but right now, there's no need to isolate yourself or for us to make you wear gowns and gloves when you come into the clinic. But it is something that you need to keep on your radar screen in terms of just common sense, hand washing type stuff. So what should we tell you, the bottom line? Right now, the guidelines that we have, both in cystic fibrosis and in the American Thoracic Society, with regard to non-tuberculous mycobacterium, really don't say anything about this issue. A group of patients was recently involved with the researchers in Oregon looking at what patients really are concerned about for research. And they didn't list this as a priority, but clearly this is something that comes up, and if you go online and look at some of the resources, you do want to know about this. So our colleagues from the NTM IR group have a great website that talks about what you can do and what you need to know about this issue of being exposed to it in the environment. I mean, what we really know is these organisms are out there, that the literature, the scientific literature in this, is really mixed on the risk to the patient, and the main thing is you, the host, being responsible for getting this infection. We also know that atmospheric conditions, as we've already heard, more humid air probably carries a little bit higher risk. So the bottom line here is that I want to leave you with the idea that this is not something you need to overly worry about, but many patients, once they're diagnosed with NTM and we put them on antibiotic treatment, know from us that there's a good chance that they're not going to be cured of their infection, and we'll hear more about that later. But what can the patient do once they've been diagnosed and treated to prevent reinfection? So I'm taking these recommendations from the NTM website, aboutntm.com, done in conjunction with NTM-IR. Again, I don't want you to go home and get under your hot water heater and turn it up and get scalded and that kind of thing. But these are just some general recommendations. Again, not that every patient in the world needs to do this, but it might be reasonable to think about a couple of these things if you've already been diagnosed and treated for NTM. I actually found there's an Italian pipe company called NTM, so maybe they need to change their name. Yeah, so there are some really, you don't need to get down and dig in the dirt like this man in the picture on the right. You don't necessarily need to use a mask either when you're gardening. Just some common sense, not sticking your nose in the dirt. Dr. Hewitt from National Jewish spoke earlier today very eloquently. We're not going to get too much into the issue of reflux and non-tuberculous mycobacterium. But again, that is another thing sort of in the environment. Just, again, common sense, like raising the head of the bed for sleeping so that you, and as already was said, don't eat a giant meal and do your airway clearance. Those are just some common sense things to prevent these issues. So, the outstanding problems is, as I already said, the match between the organisms in your pipes and the organisms in your bronchial pipes are not necessarily the same thing. We think that filtering water, changing hot water heaters are uncertain value. Although some people think that drinking water and that you might aspirate a little of that or reflux some of that, I think that's really unproven. And the connection between exposure and reinfection is not totally known. So I just conclude by saying that I'm sure people have a lot of questions about this. I mean, we have a lot of questions about this. There is an issue here, but you have to live your life basically, and think about keeping your medical equipment as clean as possible and not avoiding unnecessary exposures, particularly indoor hot tubs. I didn't mention that, but that's a no-no. Indoor hot tubs, spending a lot of time, and steam rooms, should be avoided. So I'm happy to take a quick question or two, and then we're going to have a break. Yes?
Since you brought it up, what would the guideline be for cleaning our various devices?
Yeah, so it's a little, we can give you, actually that Bronchiectasis Toolbox website is a good place to go, because there's so many different devices to talk about, that's a good place that gives you good information. Leanne?
One thing to add in is, so if you nebulize, some DME companies are providing disposable nebulizer cups while others provide reusable nebulizer cups. And one method of cleaning and sterilizing your equipment is putting it in boiling water. And if you put the disposable cups into boiling water, they will melt. So you want to make sure you know what kind of cups you have and look at that. I would reinforce, though, that using vinegar is not sufficient to kill Pseudomonas or NTM, and so if your DME company is telling you to use that, say, what are my other alternatives for cleaning this equipment?
Unfortunately, you do have to read the fine print, very fine print on because there's so many different devices that need to be attended to. Yes?
Is there any feedback on pesticides?
So the question is there any feedback on pesticide exposure in these diseases? I'm not aware of any. Yes?
What is the Bronchiectasis website?
It's called well, there's many of them, but the one that's very user-friendly for different modalities of airway clearance and these issues is called the Bronchiectasis Toolbox. It's an Australian website. We can flash it up. I have a slide somewhere. Yes?
How can you tell if an infection is based just on the condition of bronchiectasis versus an NTM infection? Because I believe it would influence the treatment, right?
So your question is, how can you tell if the infection is due to NTM or vice versa? Yeah, that's a tough one because we know that many people have NTM infection because they have abnormal lungs to start with, but there are patients clearly who have nothing wrong with their lungs as best we can tell, and the NTM is probably the cause of their bronchiectasis. So it kind of goes both ways. Yes? So the question is about indoor humidifiers. I'll have Dr. Daniels and Dr. McShane weigh in.
I've had patients ask me this, and I tell them, please don't install them in your home because the water is not boiled to enough of a temperature to be able to kill off the mycobacterium, and so then I worry that you're going to inoculate yourself or inhale it yourself. The other is also even the little small home humidifiers. Most people just fill it from their tap and do that, and so you're at risk of inhaling the mycobacterium. So if you choose to get a home humidifier, a portable one, I say use boiled or distilled water and make sure that somebody cleans it or you clean it very well, so you don't get Pseudomonas in there. Please don't leave standing water and those sorts of things.
Or just don't get one.
Yes, that too.
Yes, one more question.
So on the About NTM website, it talks about a study across 25 states where 8 out of 10 homes had NTM in their water. Is there anywhere in any of these websites that tell us what to do if we wanted to get a filter? What would be best? What would do something about it? Because there's a zillion types of filters out there, and you could spend money on something you don't need.
Well, I was going to say, my understanding is with the filters that oftentimes because it's this mesh, that's what's holding on to the mycobacterium. So the water companies that say this removes 99% of the bacteria from your water, guess what the 1% is? It's NTM. So I
Yeah,
don't-
filters don't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's more cleaning, just periodic cleaning. Let me introduce my co-chair, Dr. Tim Axamit from Mayo Clinic. He's in charge of our U.S. Bronchiectasis Research Registry. He's just going to make a brief announcement, and then we're going to take a break till, why don't we say, till 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. I just wanted to also welcome everyone. Glad to know that you're here. Give a round to our speakers, Dr. O'Donnell, for putting this together, for hosting us. Done a fantastic job. I just wanted to bring attention for those of you that have bags, and I don't know if all of you do, there is another resource. It's sponsored by the COPD Foundation. It's called Bronchiectasis and NTM Initiative. There is a website. It's a social site, so to be able to share, network with patients in a somewhat peer-reviewed, in addition to NTM IR. So again, this is just another mechanism to be able to communicate amongst yourselves in a meaningful way to try to get helpful information to how to best proceed. I'm going to leave a stack of these cards, if they're not in your bag, up here at the desk, and we'll leave a stack at the back just outside the entrance. But again, there are resources here. Don't hesitate to network with each other. Find out, gee, what was a helpful site, what was not a helpful site, and we'll move forward, because the more informed you are about these issues, the better position you're going to be in. It won't make the problem go away, won't make it any less complex, but it'll put you in a much better position to be informed. So, and with that, we'll take a break, and we'll be back. What time, Dr. O'Donnell?